Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that takes the complex, the obscure, and the seemingly impenetrable source material and turns it into concrete, actionable knowledge for you.
Today, we are wading into one of the most stubborn and I think deeply strange problems in all of philosophy and science.
We're talking about qualia.
It's the ultimate mystery, really, often called the hard problem of consciousness. If you've ever tried to truly understand what the difference is between, say, a highly sophisticated computer simulation and genuine felt human experience, you've run into qualia.
And our sources today are drawn from a pretty sophisticated philosophical dialogue that mounts a remarkable challenge.
Yeah.
They argue that the reason we are stuck debating qualia isn't because the answer is hidden in some, incredibly complex neurological circuit.
No, not at all.
It's because the very questions we are asking, the way we define reality and existence itself, are based on a flawed, unexamined worldview.
Essentially, they suggest that our culture's dominant philosophical starting point, what we consider primary and what we think is secondary, is, well, it's completely upside down. Upside down.
To truly grasp subjective experience, we might have to flip our entire metaphysical understanding. We'd have to shift from a focus on static matter to dynamic living activity.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is qualia?
In its simplest form, it is the subjective what it's like of experience. It is the raw, unanalyzed feeling.
So not the scientific explanation of a thing, but the feeling of the thing.
Exactly. It's the specific hue of the color blue you see right now, the sharp flavor profile of the coffee you had this morning, or that specific, unique, horrible sensation of stubbing your toe.
Right. Everyone knows that feeling.
And qualia is the qualitative content of those mental processes.
Mm.
It's the difference between knowing that a light wave has a certain frequency, that's the objective fact, and having the personal, internal, non-transferable feeling of seeing blue.
The subjective experience. Yes. And the core mystery that has puzzled philosophers for centuries is figuring out how these unique internal personal feelings can possibly arise from or relate to the measurable, objective, physical brain structure, the wetware.
So our mission today is to follow this source material's argument that the subjective nature of qualia is not a philosophical side effect or some kind of computational bug.
No, it's a feature.
Instead, it is a primary feature of existence that forces us to realize the radical individuality of all experience. We're going to look at the tension that arises when you try to apply the most foundational rule of logic to something as slippery as perception.
And we will see that the traditional classical worldview, by clinging to its initial flawed premise, is forced into a continuous process of invention. It's constantly creating concepts like emergence, which the sources argue function as absolute metaphors.
Absolute metaphors, what does that mean?
It means they're placeholders. They mask the contradictions that are baked into the system from the very beginning.
Okay, so a big task ahead of us. Let's start with that foundational logic.
To start this process of, let's call it, rigorous philosophical correction, we begin with a concept that predates modern science by millennia.
Okay.
The principle of the excluded third, often known as the law of the excluded middle, or just LET for short.
Right, I remember this from Philosophy 101. This is the very foundation of Western logical thought, isn't it?
It is, and the principle itself is deceptively simple. For any given statement, that statement must be either true or false.
No gray area.
There's absolutely no third option. A fact either exists or it does not exist. It's binary.
If you declare, I am drinking coffee, that statement, at the time you utter it, is either true or it is false. Simple.
Exactly. This binary certainty is how we build systems, how we categorize information, how we perform mathematics. Now, the source material asks the critical question. Does the law of the excluded third apply to something as seemingly fluid and, well, non-binary as qualia?
At first blush, it seems like a ridiculous question. I mean, how can the entire spectrum of human feeling, all the nuance, color, taste, sound, be reduced to a simple true or false? It feels like we are trying to force a rich, qualitative experience into a purely quantitative box.
We are, but only if we misidentify what we are applying the logic to.
Okay, explain that.
Let's use the classic example of the color blue again. If I ask you right now, or if you, the listener, simply look at something blue, you either experience the subjective sensation of blue or you don't.
Ah, I see.
While the feeling itself is qualitative, the existence of that specific experience is binary. It's a switch. The internal state is either present or it is absent.
So the LET doesn't apply to the quality of the blue, like how vivid it is or what shade it is, but to the brute fact that the subjective experience of blue is happening right now. I either have the experience or I don't.
Precisely. And this is where the sources introduce what they call the physiological correction. This is a crucial step.
Oh, correct.
Yes, because we often fall into linguistic traps that make the qualia problem seem unsolvable. Colloquially, for instance, we say that an object has the color blue,
Right, the car is blue.
which is convenient, but scientifically we know it's wrong. It's a shorthand that hides the real mechanism.
Because the color isn't a property of the object itself in the way we commonly imagine. The object just reflects certain wavelengths of light. The color blue, as an experience, is generated entirely inside the observer's nervous system.
The accurate, necessary starting point for this analysis is that the perception of blue is an internal state.
An internal state.
It's a specific configuration adopted by the nervous system. Your nervous system either adopts the specific configuration corresponding to the experience of blue, or it adopts a different configuration for red or yellow, or, a state of not seeing a color at all.
This shift in focus from an external object to an internal configured state is huge. I can see that.
It is.
It allows us to keep the LET.
Right.
My nervous system is either configured this way seeing blue, or it is not configured this way. True or false?
Exactly.
But wait, if we accept this, and we accept that the configuration is internal, doesn't that just make the whole process completely subjective and non-measurable? Doesn't that sort of defeat the purpose of science?
That is exactly the next step, but it's crucial to understand why that non-measurability occurs. It's not a bug. By framing subjective experience as an individual existing configuration that's subject to the LET, we establish that at any moment, that state either exists or doesn't.
Okay.
And that forces us to move past the static observation of the state.
Because if the configuration exists now,
Mm-hmm.
it must have come from somewhere.
Yes. The next unavoidable philosophical question is, how did that specific individual configuration, that subjective blue state, come into existence in the first place? We can no longer just point to the brain and say it is there. We are forced to look backward
Away from the static result.
and towards the dynamic generating process. What's fascinating here is that the failure of the traditional qualia debate isn't that they can't find the blue state in the brain.
It's that they only ever look at the finished product, the result.
The finished result, which, being a result, is binary. It exists or it doesn't exist. By focusing only on that result, they skip the entire complex temporal process of creation and learning that define the configuration in the first place.
So the living part of the system.
The dynamic living part of the system is automatically excluded from the analysis from the very beginning. The game is rigged before it even starts.
This transition forces us directly into the issue of individuality. We establish that the configuration for seeing blue is an individual configuration. But if all humans share the same basic neurological structure, why would the configuration be different for me than for you?
This is where the source material gets fascinating and truly pushes back against standardized neuroscientific models. They assert that the configuration corresponding to blue in you is highly likely to be structurally different from the configuration in me.
Really? That different?
Yes. We share the word blue, and we share the functional outcome. We both agree the sky is blue. We can both pick the blue crayon out of the box. But the internal configuration that supports that functional outcome is unique to our individual histories.
Wait, if the underlying configuration is radically individual, how can a neuroscientist ever definitively measure the feeling of blue in a standardized way? It seems like you're saying science is chasing a phantom that changes from person to person.
That's precisely the point. This radical individuality makes it impossible to establish general, 100% doubt-free criteria to objectively detect or measure a subjective experience via external tools like an fMRI or an EEG. It's a fool's errand.
So if you try to scan my brain and isolate my blue pattern,
That pattern is specific to your neural architecture and your unique learning history. It's yours and yours alone.
so if they scan 100 people seeing blue, and they find 100 slightly different neural patterns, the classical approach assumes these are just noisy data points that need to be averaged out to find the real blue pattern.
Yes, exactly. They assume there must be a universal configuration waiting to be uncovered beneath all that noise. But the argument here in the source is that the noise is the signal.
The noise is the signal.
The unique patterns are not errors. They are the reflections of individual lived experience. Any measurement, therefore, only captures the static result of the configuration at a single moment in time. It fundamentally misses the personal, unique path that generated that result.
So the universal blue configuration is an artifact of our need to categorize and generalize, not a biological reality of lived experience.
It's a statistical fiction, a useful one maybe, but a fiction nonetheless.
Let's really drill down into that generating mechanism then. Yeah. The birth of blue. The source uses that great thought experiment, someone who has never experienced blue before.
Right. We know they have the eyes and the neurons to process the specific wavelengths of light, but they lack the necessary internal configuration to classify and feel blue in the way a sighted person does.
So what happens when they see it for the first time?
When that person is confronted with blue light wavelengths for the first time, their active nervous system must solve a completely novel puzzle. It's not about passively receiving data like a camera. It's about generating a new internal solution.
So the old pathways for red or yellow won't work.
They're insufficient. The living nervous system, as an active problem-solving entity, is tasked with assimilating this new input into its existing framework. It has to make sense of it.
And crucially, this solution is not a simple data transfer, like downloading an image file. I mean, if the visual experience of blue happened only once, it would likely be ignored.
Dismissed as a momentary glitch or a temporary flicker.
Correct. This process of configuration is characterized by two things: activity and repetition.
How so?
The solution is found through active engagement. The subject has to look at the blue object, then glance away at objects of known colors, red, green, and then look back again. They're often moving their eyes, their head, even reaching out to touch the object.
They're interacting with it. This repeated, self-initiated movement and comparison, this dynamic interaction with the world, is what the source defines as learning in the most fundamental sense.
The analogy they use, which I think is so potent, is that of walking a new path through tall grass.
Ah, yes. It's a perfect metaphor.
If you walk it once, the grass just springs back up, no path is made. But repeated movement, repeated action solidifies the path, making it easier and faster to traverse the next time.
And the new neural configuration is literally the physical solidification of that repeated action taken in response to the light input. It connects activity directly to structure.
So the structure of the nervous system is an historical record of the activity that created it.
Precisely. If your body moved differently than mine when you first learned to categorize blue, perhaps you had to turn your head farther, or you initially compared to purple instead of green. That unique trajectory is written into the configuration itself.
This realization changes what we believe the nervous system is actually storing. If it's not passive data, what is it?
The configurations are not static passive data or, mental images of a wavelength. They are what the sources call activity contexts.
Activity context.
If we were to use the specific philosophical terms from the source, they call them handlungszusammenhang.
Right. Let's stick with activity contexts.
Probably for the best.
Yeah.
But it means the crucial link between the movement or action of the individual and the resulting sensory feedback.
So the nervous system isn't storing blue equals 450 nanometers. It's storing something far richer, something like the action of moving my eye or head in this specific way combined with the sensory input of 450 nanometers results in this unique internal stable state we call blue. Is that right?
That is precisely right. The configuration includes the action taken to form it. The context of how the knowledge was acquired, the bodily agency involved, is inseparable from what was learned.
And if you attempt to isolate the blue state without referencing that history of movement and comparison that solidified it,
you only get an incomplete secondary slice of reality. You get the shadow, not the thing itself.
this is where I start to see the practical implications for things like, artificial intelligence or machine consciousness.
Absolutely.
If we build an AI that can process 450 nanometers and label it blue, based purely on passive input and an algorithmic map, that AI hasn't learned blue in a living, active sense.
It lacks the internal history of self-initiated action necessary to create a subjective activity context.
It has data.
It has data, but it lacks the qualitative experience derived from active, unique learning. It lacks the unique historical path. And that is why the old philosophical debates, asking how matter produces experience, are fundamentally misdirected.
Because they start with the wrong premise.
They treat the nervous system as a static, passive container waiting to be filled with data, rather than a dynamic, active agent constantly generating unique solutions to environmental puzzles. You're not trying to find how two static lumps of matter produce experience. You're trying to understand how two dynamic, active learning processes generate functionally equivalent, yet structurally unique experiences. Now that we've established that qualia is inherently tied to this highly individual primary activity in history, we have to confront the biggest hurdle of all.
which is.
The mainstream philosophical worldview that resists this idea so powerfully.
This feels like where we leave neuroscience behind and get into pure metaphysics, challenging the very foundations of how we define reality.
Exactly. And let's look at how quale is typically defined. If you consult standard references, like Wikipedia or a textbook, they'll call it the subjective experience content of mental processes.
Seems straightforward.
But notice the implicit assumption in that phrase. This subjective content is automatically relegated to secondary status.
Secondary to what? To the primary reality, which is usually defined as physical processes, matter, the objective brain states.
Correct. The dominant worldview of the last few centuries assumes that things matter, stuff, neurons, atoms, are the primary existence. Everything else, like consciousness, mind, and subjective feeling, must be derived from it.
First, there is the inert material brain.
And then something is added, the qualitative feeling, to make the process complete.
And that's the deeply ingrained cultural lens we all look through. I mean, we define existence by what we can measure, weigh, and categorize, which are all properties of matter. If you can't point to it as a thing, it must be a derivative of a thing.
And the sources argue that this very assumption, that static non-living matter is the primary existence, is the single greatest flaw in the entire debate. This leads to what they call an artificial discrepancy.
A discrepancy.
We start with non-living matter, and then suddenly we see living, conscious, active beings, and we have this immense, seemingly insurmountable explanatory gap.
So, because our starting premise lacks the concept of fundamental activity, we have to invent ways for that activity to suddenly appear out of nowhere.
Precisely. And in this classical worldview, we rely heavily on concepts to bridge this gap. The most famous one, of course, is emergence.
Reemergence, we hear this everywhere. Consciousness is an emergent property of the brain.
And emergence claims that when matter is organized in sufficient complexity, like in the brain novel, properties that are not reducible to the components suddenly emerge.
But the critique here is that this doesn't actually explain how the unique primary subjective experience arises. It just names the fact that it does.
It acts as an absolute metaphor. It describes the phenomenon, the appearance of something new, without providing the mechanism. And it can't provide the mechanism because that mechanism, primary activity, was excluded from the initial premise.
It's like saying magic happened here.
It provides a sense of intellectual closure without providing any pathway to understanding the origin.
Okay, I need a moment of clarification here. This is a big idea. If we invert the primacy, if we reject the idea that matter is primary, what is the radical alternative being proposed here?
The proposition is this. The activity of a living being, the capacity for self-initiated movement, learning, and action, is the primary reality.
Activity is primary.
Qualia and consciousness are not secondary additions to matter, nor are they emergent properties of matter. They are fundamental, intrinsic aspects of active, living existence. They belong to what we can broadly call agency.
But hold on. If activity and agency are primary, does that mean matter, the physical brain, is somehow secondary? Or a byproduct of activity? That feels fundamentally counterintuitive to everything we've been taught since childhood.
It is deeply counterintuitive, but yes, that is the implication. The physical structure of the brain, the matter, is viewed here not as the origin of activity, but as the accumulated history and manifestation of that ongoing primary activity.
So the brain is the structural result of a history of action, learning, and self-organization.
That's the idea. It's a total revolution in perspective. We stop viewing the nervous system as a static lump of matter that somehow sparks experience.
And start viewing it as a physical record of an ongoing primary active existence that intrinsically includes experience from the get-go.
And this reframes how we interpret scientific observation. Think about scanning a brain. When we observe an individual, when we take an fMRI reading of their neural activity, what are we actually seeing?
We think we're seeing thought.
But we are only seeing the secondary results of their primary inner, unobservable activity.
I see. The neural state is like an echo or a shadow of the primary activity that generated it.
Precisely. The detectable events, the blood flow changes, the electrochemical states, the surface movements, those are the reflections of their primary activity. If I look at you, I see your arm move, which is the secondary result.
But you cannot observe the intrinsic will or intention, the primary activity that drove that movement.
Exactly. A brain scan is identical. It detects the results of the activity, the solidified configuration, but it fails to capture the primary activity or the qualitative experience itself.
So when we, as neuroscientists, try to use a secondary tool, like a brain scan, which measures matter, to understand a primary phenomenon's subjective, active experience, it's no wonder we fail.
We're using the wrong tool for the job.
We're capturing the geological record of an earthquake and trying to understand the earthquake itself only by studying the resulting cracks in the ground.
That's an excellent analogy. We are capturing the residue, the structural consequence, and we mistake it for the living process. And the implications of this worldview critique extend far beyond just the qualia debate.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you mentioned the origin of life itself.
Yes. The struggle that science often has in explaining how life arose from inanimate matter, that transition from the non-living to the living, stems from the exact same initial error.
Because you're starting from the wrong place.
If you define the foundational basis of the universe as static, non-living existence, then you have to constantly perform philosophical acrobatics to explain how primary activity, self-creation, and life appear.
You are trying to add activity and agency to a system that is, by its very definition, fundamentally defined as non-active and inert. You are trying to derive the dynamic from the static.
And that requires inventing concepts like emergence to mask the contradiction. We've fundamentally mismatched our categories. The living system is intrinsically active and generating. The classical worldview is built on inert, static existence. We must recognize that the two are in fundamental opposition from the start.
So now we generalize this critique. The source dialogue argues that the reliance on the principle of the excluded third doesn't just cripple the quality debate, it cripples the classical worldview itself.
It does.
And it forces it to eliminate two of the most fundamental aspects of lived experience: time and agency.
The foundation of the classical worldview is built exclusively on existence. Things that definitively exist or do not exist, and are therefore perfectly subject to the binary true-false logic of the LAT.
And this approach is incredibly powerful.
Oh, absolutely. It allows us to categorize, count, measure, and build predictable, stable systems.
It's the logic we use for every engineering project, every balance sheet, and every legal contract. A bridge either exists or it doesn't. A number is either odd or it isn't.
Precisely. But the source material notes that this classical model utterly fails to explain how things become or change. The moment something is in the process of becoming, the moment there is activity, movement, or novelty, it is no longer purely defined by existence or non-existence.
It is neither fully A nor fully not A.
It is A in process, and the classical model has no category for A in process.
This is a huge conceptual gap. I mean, if I am building a house, at no point during construction can I truthfully say the house exists or the house does not exist. It is in a state of becoming.
And that intermediate state, that state of dynamic generating activity, is what must be eliminated to make the LAT applicable. If the classical system cannot categorize it, it deletes it. It pretends it doesn't exist.
And this deletion of process is perfectly demonstrated when we analyze philosophical paradoxes.
Right. Let's talk about the liar paradox.
All cretins lie. If a cretin says this statement, is it true or false? If it's true, he's lying, which makes it false. If it's false, he's telling the truth, which makes it true.
And around we go. The famous paradox arises not because reality is contradictory, but because the observer insists on applying the static, binary logic of the LAT to a situation that is inherently dynamic and temporal.
So how does the paradox arise? By eliminating activity. Where's the deletion?
The paradox arises only when the observer deliberately eliminates the individual's primary activity, their ability to speak, their Handlungsfähigkeit, their agency. The observer reduces the active subject, the cretin, who is a living being capable of speech, truth, and lies, and reduces him solely to the static linguistic result, the statement he uttered.
So we take a dynamic action, the act of communication, which involves intent, context, and time, and we strip it down to a timeless, context-free statement, which we then try to force into a static, true-false box.
And the box breaks. The statement loops endlessly because the model has excluded the essential component that anchors it to reality, the agency and the temporality of the speaker. The paradox is not a puzzle about language. It is the philosophical model failing because it has insisted on removing the active, living subject.
And this brings us to the most radical implication of all, which you mentioned, the elimination of time itself.
Yes. If the classical worldview is built on static existence, A or not A, which are timeless, then the classical worldview necessarily rejects time as a fundamental reality.
So
Time is inherent to activity, movement, and the generation of new things. You cannot have activity without temporality. If the foundation of reality is defined by timeless existence, which is the necessary conclusion of clinging purely to the LET, then you must treat time as secondary.
Almost an illusion or just a measure of change rather than a primary feature of reality.
And this is often how we approach time in physics, isn't it? As a coordinate, a dimension, or a measure of duration, rather than the intrinsic engine of change.
Right.
When reality is defined as timeless existence, you must then artificially reintroduce time and change back into the system, often using those absolute metaphors like emergence, to explain novelty. And that leads directly to the endless contradictions we see in various time paradoxes.
Because time cannot be simultaneously necessary for change, but secondary to timeless existence. It's a foundational contradiction.
It's a house of cards.
So the trade-off is clear. The classical worldview is incredibly useful for building measurable hierarchies, technology, and stable political and economic systems. It gives us clarity and precision. We can count things.
But we purchase that clarity at a cost.
At the cost of dynamism, life, and temporality. As the sources put it, it is sad because it is fundamentally incapable of explaining life, novelty, and consciousness without constantly cheating and inventing concepts to patch the hole.
And this inability to understand how new things come into being is exactly why the qualia debate remains stuck. We insist on applying timeless static logic, the LAT, to measure the static result, the configuration,
while deliberately ignoring the primary, temporal, active, and unique process of becoming that created the configuration in the first place.
If we accept the premise that qualia is derived from unique, individual, historical activity, then the moment we try to objectify it, to remove that history and that time, it vanishes. It has to.
So the ineffability of qualia is not some mystical property. It is the necessary consequence of using the wrong logical framework to look at it.
Exactly. You can't measure a process with a ruler designed for static objects.
Okay, let's review the core lesson here for you, the listener. We began by forcing the fundamental logic of the excluded third onto subjective experience.
Which, perhaps surprisingly, immediately led us to recognize that the subjective feeling of blue is an individual, unique configuration.
We then dove deep into the radical conclusion that this individuality is tied to our unique history of bodily action and self-initiated activity contexts. It's not what you see, but what you did to see it.
And the final takeaway is that the perceived inability to measure qualia objectively is not a failure of the subjective phenomenon itself. It's a fundamental flaw in our objective worldview, our reliance on static material existence as the primary reality.
Clarity on qualia, then, is dependent on redefining the very foundations of existence, moving from a focus on static results, existence that conform to the LET, to dynamic processes, activity and agency.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
So, what does this all mean? We live in a world that is obsessed with understanding and replicating intelligence. If the classical worldview eliminates both activity and time, forcing us to invent these absolute metaphors like emergence to explain life and consciousness, what foundational shifts must occur in fields like computational neuroscience and the search for machine consciousness?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? If engineers attempt to build genuine consciousness based purely on scanning and mapping the measurable secondary results of the human brain, treating the brain as a passive data processor, rather than understanding and replicating the primary temporal active process of self-initiated learning and unique configuration creation.
Are they destined to simply create systems that appear functional only so long as we eliminate their living temporal context?
Are they just building an extremely sophisticated, highly functional version of the liar paradox, a system that works perfectly until we demand it accounts for its own agency?
A deeply provocative thought, and one that shifts the focus from what the brain is to what the living being does. Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us.